Welcome to another SNA Speakeasy. Today, I believe, yes, I think it's our first guest who's talking to us from the island of Hokkaido up north. And he is, in fact, a professor of the University of Hokkaido. And I believe it's also our first topic that deals with space issues. We often deal more with political issues here at the SNA Speakeasy, but technology also falls within some of the areas that we're interested in. And in fact, I believe he's also going to talk about security policy, so it does intersect with politics as well. His name is Kazuto Suzuki, and why don't you sort of introduce yourself? How is it that you became an expert in space policy?
Right. Well, thank you very much, Michael. My name is Kazuto Suzuki. I am teaching international politics or international political economy at the Hokkaido University. It's a little long story that I started to come across with space issue. My research was basically about what is the main driver of the globalization and which changes the international order. And when you see that, the dynamics of the globalization, it is the technology which makes a lot of difference. But also, I think it is interesting to see how technology involves in the security issue, which remains to be very national. So I thought it will be interesting to focus on the technology side, to how technology works as the driving force of the globalization, at the same time to strengthen the national capabilities. So usually the globalization undermines the national autonomy, national capabilities, but the technology works both ways. So I thought that was interesting, and the space is a typical, dual-use technology, which goes to both the civilian side and the security side. So that's why I pick up space. So I have no fascination in the science fictions, or I have no desire. Although if it's possible, I'll be happy to. But I have no desire to be an astronaut or going to the moon or whatever. So my interest on space didn't come from this sort of a fascination on the space, but it is coming from the more drier, sort of a rational way of understanding the current international order. So that's why I'm here.
Well, I appreciate the importance of the issues that you raised, but at the same time, don't count out science fiction. It can be rather fun and enjoyable. um,
I'm not saying that it's not enjoyable. I'm saying that I come across with the space not because of my fascination, but because of my professional reasons. And I read science fiction on my bedside, but it's not how I bring myself to this subject.
okay, fair enough. So, the first question is a broad question, but I think it's an important question. When we look around, I mean, you mentioned already that space development is often on a national basis. Each country has its space program, and when we think historically, of course, we think the leaders of the space race traditionally were the Soviet Union and the United States. Um, and when we look at the world today in 2020, uh, is Japan a top tier space technology power, or is it in a second rank sort of thing, or third rank? Where does it place basically internationally?
Well, of course, if you compare the technological capabilities, I think the United States and China today are the top two. And then the following, there is a sort of a second tier group, which is Russia, European Union, or it's not exactly European Union because it includes Britain. So it's Europe and Japan, India. So these are the sort of a top 6 in the sort of world ranking. And then you have several sort of countries with particular interest in certain activities, such as Canada on the robotics, or Israel for the security reasons, or there are a number of countries, but I think a major player in the world today is the United States and China, followed by Japan, Europe, Russia, and India.
Okay, they do seem to be the ones who show up the most in the discussions of space issues. All right, and within that group of 6 who are world leaders in the field of space, has it developed a certain identity in areas in which it's particularly strong, or that it specializes in?
Well, that's a good question. I think it is interesting that space has started from the space race between the Soviet Union and United States. Then since the collapse of Soviet Union, Russia has not invested much in space, but these are the 2 major countries which done everything and first in the humanity kind of things. But Japan has developed the unique capability on the science side to visit the asteroid Itokawa and pick up some dust from the asteroid and then bring it back, which is called the sample return. The sample return is the first. The successful sample return is the first one was the Apollo program that brings the moon rocks, but it has done by the human space. People, the astronauts went there and pick up the rocks. But now I think that Japan is the only one which was successful to pick up the dust or rocks by unmanned the remote robotics mission. So that's the unique part. The Japan has a policy of focusing on the civilian programs. So in 1969, the Japanese Diet, the parliament, has declared that the Japanese space program is solely for the peaceful purposes, which means that all the military authorities are not allowed to engage in space, which means that the Ministry of Defense or the Self-Defense Force are not allowed to use, develop, or operate a spacecraft. So for many years, the military side of the Japanese space program are excluded. At the same time, the space commercial side were also excluded because during 1980s, the Japan and United States had a long and winding negotiation of the trade friction. And the United States put the pressure on Japan to open up the Japanese market. And one of the markets that the United States want to be in is the market for the commercial satellites. So the United States did not allow Japan to develop the commercially capable satellites, and it only allows these satellites by the public funding. So eventually, the Japanese space industry and space agencies, JAXA, has focused on those R&D satellites, which are not being used for the commercial purposes. So the Japanese space industry are not commercially competitive in the international market, and Japanese space industry were not allowed to invest in the military space. So Japan has focused pretty much on the R&D and developed a unique capability on the space technology. So that leads to this unique robotic sample return program from the asteroid.
Okay, well, I want to touch on both of those sides, but let's start with the latter part about the non-commercial aspect of the Japanese program. I think I've read, and correct me if I'm wrong, quite recently, isn't Japan getting involved in commercial rockets of some kind?
Yep. Yep.
So can you tell us when did this start, and how did it break away from this policy that you're talking about?
Right. Well, that's another good point. That the Japan, because Japan had these constraints it's a self-imposed constraints by the 1969 Diet Resolution and the 1980s negotiation with the United States. These are hindering the Japanese potentials of the Japanese space industry. So the politicians became aware that if we go on like this, then the Japanese space program are not sustainable. So they approached me, actually, and I was involved in the process of the transformation of the Japanese space policy. And that started in 2005 when the Japanese launcher failed to carry 2 satellites, which are used for the surveillance purposes on the North Korea. These are not considered as a military satellite because it's only a surveillance and it's for the information gathering rather than target selection. So so it was allowed within this interpretation of the peaceful purpose, and but in 2005 these 2 satellites are gone because the JAXA, which were the responsible agency to develop the launcher, failed. And when the JAXA was asked to explain why it failed, then the JAXA responded that this is failed because it's R&D satellite, it's R&D rocket. The R&D always have elements of the failure. You are testing new things. So, the new technology are not always reliable. And, if you test the new technology, then, you may fail. And the JAXA was saying that, okay, this is R&D, therefore, it failed. And then people got mad about this explanation because this is a national security and you are not supposed to fail. And has to deliver on the satellites which are developed by the taxpayers' money. So that was the time that the things had changed. And in 2008, well, since 2005, there were numerous discussions, study groups, the LDP, the ruling parties, policy councils, and then there was an involvement of the Komeito and the DPJ by then, the largest opposition party. These 3 parties involved in developing a new legislation called the Basic Space Law. So I was involved in this process of the legislation, and and the main purpose is that to remove the constraints of the 1969 resolution and to allow Japanese agencies, including the MOD and the Self-Defense Force, to use and to operate the satellites within the limits of the Constitution. And the second point was to enhance and deliver the Japanese programs, to engage government authorities, not only the development agencies, but also the user agencies, such as the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transportation, etc., to engage in space as a users, to promote the user-friendly programs, satellite programs, which eventually leads to the commercially competitive products. So this is another way of avoiding this agreement with the United States. In the agreement with the United States, the Japanese government were only allowed to invest in the R&D program, but it didn't prevent the Japanese authorities to become as a customer of the services of the satellite. So that this basic space law encourages the government agencies to use the space-based satellite services, and as a result, the new the space-oriented, the satellite service programs, such as the QZSS, the Quasi-Zenith Satellite System, which is sort of a GPS on the regional scale, were introduced. So this 2008 basic space law was the turning point of the Japanese space program, and which allows the Japanese government to work on the both commercially competitive products and the security-oriented programs.
In Japan, is there anything like SpaceX, a private company that has the ambitions or has moved some way into becoming a non-state space service organization?
Yes. Although the SpaceX is a monster in the space market. I mean, Elon Musk has done a lot, and there is nobody comparable to the SpaceX success. But there are small private space ventures now emerging in the Japanese market as well. One of which is based in Hokkaido, my prefecture, to launch the small launcher, not like the one in the SpaceX, but a smaller launcher to carry a smaller satellite in a very low price. So this is called the Interstellar Technologies, and it has been working on the sounding rocket, which means that it's still an experimental rocket, but it's not. So it hasn't carried any satellites yet, but they are now experimenting these engines that they are developing. So that's one promising space venture. The other one is a very unique space-based venture called the Astroscale. Astroscale is the organization to develop the satellite to remove the space debris. Space debris is the junk in orbit, which may hit to other satellites, and which is like a big rock in the highway. So you need to remove them, or you just duck them. Currently, the only way is to duck them, but the Astroscale is trying to provide the services to remove those space debris, and they are now progressing their program, and they are going to launch their satellites to take out the debris in I think in this year. The third unique space venture is called ALE, A-L-E. ALE is a very unique service provider to launch a satellite which shoot the smaller projectile to the Earth so that they can make the artificial shooting star. So that's the sort of a new. They consider this is a new service as an entertainment. So if it's like a fireworks. So you are sending a fireworks from the space. So that's the unique one, which are now, well, I don't know how much. It's a totally new service, so I don't know how much the demand is, but still, it's a unique one.
I'll certainly grant you that. I wouldn't have thought of that one myself. All right, so our topic is about the security implications of the Japanese space program. So I guess I'll ask you a tough question right off the bat. Is most of this space development by the state just a cover for military development, but in a way that doesn't raise as many political objections, or is there or do we mean something else when we talk about the security implications?
Well, there are different countries have different reasons to do space. The United States and Soviet Union has done the space race not only because they wanted to do the military side, but also it's for the national pride. It's for the winning or losing against the, it's a sort of a symbol of the free world against the communism, that sort of thing. So it's like there is an element of Olympics, winning a gold medal doesn't really prove anything that other than you are great, but it doesn't really have the security implications. So sometimes people mix up. Also, there are countries like India who are doing space not for the national pride or security purposes. The India recently engaged in the space security program, but for many years, Indian objective was to achieve or to use space as the infrastructure, because India has a huge, the vast majority of the Indian people are living in the countryside, and they are, and if you think about the size of population in India, it is almost impossible to build the schools for all the children. So instead of building a school, they are launching a satellite which is called the EduSat, which is solely dedicated to education. So there are a number of the TV programs on the curriculum for the elementary school or to high schools, and it broadcasted all over India, so that you don't have to build the school, but you have the TV set, and then you have a classroom, so that you don't need to build, you don't need to train the teachers. So that sort of things. The Indian space program is basically aiming for this, providing services for society. The Europeans, although the Europeans are very unique, because Europeans are developing their national security program by the state level, like France, Germany, and Britain, and Italy. But they are building the commercial satellites by European altogether. So they created the institution called the European Space Agency to develop the science and the commercially competitive programs. So the Ariane rocket, which has been the largest commercial launch provider for many years until the SpaceX arrived, and still the Ariane rocket is commercially competitive. So the major objective for the Europeans are being, to engage in the commercial market. So there are different countries have a different objective, and Japan, the Japanese space until 2008 was mainly for the technology, to catch up with the U.S. and Soviets and trying to do a lots of R&D because we are not supposed to do the military or commercial programs. So the Japanese space program are mainly focusing on the technology and science. But since 2008, yes, the Japanese have the Ministry of Defense and the Self-Defense Force were allowed to engage in the space program. But the problem is that once you get used to build up your military programs without space, it's hard to change that culture. And Ministry of Defense they were very hesitant to invest in space because they thought that, okay, we do have a commercial services, we do have allied assets, so why do we need to have our own space? And most of all, the Japanese military are basically a territorial defense military. We don't send our troops to outside. We don't have the extraterritorial bases except Djibouti. We are not engaged in the sort of a warfare in outside of our territory, which means that we don't need the space capabilities because we are more or less covered by the terrestrial assets. So the space is not the sort of a major priority for the self-defense force to build, but nevertheless, they are gradually realizing that the space is important in the modern warfare for the intelligence gathering, for the command and control, for a variety of the connectivity issues. So they are now gradually getting into the interest in space, and also Japan is engaged in the global network of the Space Situational Awareness (SSA). The SSA is to monitor the movement of debris and any space objects in the orbit. So what happens is that if you although the Ministry of Defense doesn't have much space assets of their own, but the Japanese satellites are there. There are Earth observation satellites, there are communication satellites, and the quasi-zenith satellite systems, etc., etc. So in order to protect these Japanese assets, we need to monitor the space situation, because if those satellites were hit by the debris, then it will easily lose our capabilities, socio-economic capabilities. So in order to protect the Japanese assets, the Ministry of Defense is now operating the space radar, or building the space radar and the space telescope to monitor those debris. So that's the reason why the Space Operational Squadron was established in the Ministry of Defense.
I've read various places that in the U.S. Sort of global surveillance networks that the Japan plays a fairly major role, mainly because of its spy satellites. That they're basically very closely tied in with, whatever the Five Eyes network, or however you want to call it. that this is really Japan's major contribution in terms of sort of espionage world. To what extent has Japan developed first-class surveillance satellites?
Well, Japan has developed the so-called the IGS, the information gathering satellite, which are not the military satellite but the surveillance satellite, which is now currently in operation since 2002. There are 4 satellites, 2 optical, which is like the usual camera, and the 2 SAR, the synthetic aperture radar satellites, which takes a picture in reflection of the electromagnetic pulse, electromagnetic waves, and they are these are the 4 satellites which are monitoring the major hotspots like North Korea and China, and these are it's a complementary intelligence satellite for the U.S. services, but it is basically on the how do I say? It's a give and take relationship. So that the Japan will Japan may ask the United States to provide satellite imagery. At the same time, the United States may ask Japan to provide the satellite imagery. So it's a give and take relationship, and because the satellites are in a different orbit, so they are taking pictures in a different time frame, and therefore, if there is no U.S. satellite but the Japanese satellite on a certain time of the day, then the Japanese satellite picture will be useful for the U.S. Authorities.
Okay, my second to last question is, recently we've been hearing a lot, in particular, about the Hayabusa II, which is non-military, but it went to this asteroid Ryugu and landed little rovers on it and blew up little pieces and are bringing them back to Australia here, I think, in December, and then going off on another mission. This really seems to be showing a level of visibility for Japan's space program in a way that I'm not sure has ever been the case before. So what do you think is sort of the impact in terms of raising the visibility of the Japanese space program that's been created by the Hayabusa II?
Well, I think it raised a lot. I mean, for internationally speaking, this is the first in the humanity kind of program, and it proved the level of technology for the Japanese space program. So as I said, the Japanese space program are largely focused on the technology development, and we proved it that it was the right thing to do. So, but at the same time, I think it was pretty much increased the visibility within the country that the first Hayabusa, was full of drama. It had a lot of difficulties of losing one engines and bump into the Itokawa, and then so it has a sort of a lot of history and a lot of stories to tell. And after Hayabusa came back to Japan, there were 3 movies were created by that story. So compared to that, Hayabusa 2 is not as attractive as the first one, but because the Hayabusa 2 is it's going through smoothly, and there is not much drama. They went there, did the job, and coming back. So it's not coming as the sort of the national subject. I don't think that there will be 3 movies on the Hayabusa 2, but nevertheless, for the internationally speaking, the the result that Hayabusa 2 may bring is much bigger, and I think it will have much bigger stories outside Japan.
All right, and my final question before we move to the patron Q&A is my traditional last question, which is there something that I should have asked you that I didn't ask you that you'd like to comment upon?
Well, yeah, there are a number of things about the rockets. For example, Japan is now Japan has a very successful rate on launching the satellite by H2A, which is the current major main launcher, and this has launched the satellite built by UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and to send the probe to the Mars. So this is the first Arabian satellite going to Mars, and currently the Earth and the Mars are the most the closest. I don't know how to call
orbit.
it. It's in a sort of a different orbit, and the Mars and Earth is now the closest. And
as I understand, that's like once every 12 or 14 years or something like that, right?
Yeah, well, something like that. Yeah, and now there is a sort of a rush of launching the probe to Mars, and one of which is the UAE, another is China. China has launched recently, and also the US is now preparing to launch tomorrow, I think. So UAE, we are happy that the Japanese launcher was successfully launched, the first of its kind in the Arab countries, and this has been a very nervous moment because there is a lot of attention from the Arab world and also the Islamic world as well. So we feel a very strong responsibility to be successful, and we were. So that's our pride. And again, I think this is the proof that Japan has invested a lot in R&D, and we have the sort of a state-of-the-art technology in the launcher as well. The problem is that even though this H2A is so successful, but the number of launches are limited, and also because it's the launcher needs to be developed in a certain direction, which means that we need to build the bigger launcher to carry a bigger satellite. So Japanese authority decided to scrap the H2A and to build the H3. So we are dumping all this, the history of success, but I hope that this H3 will be as successful as H2A.
Okay. And with that, we'll move to the patron Q&A.